So good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining, and welcome to the press conference of the International Independent Expert Mechanism to Advance Racial Justice and Equality in the Context of Law Enforcement. In 2021, further to the presentation of the High Commissioner for Human Rights report on racial justice and equality to end systemic racism and human rights violations by law enforcement against Africans and people of African descent, the Human Rights Council established the International Independent Expert Mechanism to advance racial justice and equality in the context of law enforcement. The expert mechanism was given a 3-year mandate to advance racial justice and equality, and it is mandated to conduct in all parts of the world country visits, inclusive outreach, consultations with states, directly affected individuals and communities and other stakeholders. The mechanism just completed a 2-week visit to the United States. This is its first visit to the country, and it was undertaken at the invitation of the US government. The mechanism is composed of 3 experts: Justice Mogoro from South Africa, who's the chairperson of the mechanism, Professor Juan Mendez of Argentina, and Dr. Tracy Kizee from the US. Because of an accident, Justice Mogoro unfortunately could not be part of this mission. I will now pass the floor to the 2 experts for preliminary remarks, and we will then open the discussion to questions, starting first with journalists in the room, and then with those who are joining this press conference remotely. When you take the floor, please indicate your name and the outlet which you represent, and I thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Thank you. Thank you for the thumbs up. I'm Dr. Tracy Kizee, and we're here today to share with you some preliminary findings from our visit, of course, which is concluding today, as Yasmin mentioned. We express our appreciation to the U.S. for the invitation and to conduct our official visit. For the cooperation and the mechanism, so there were a lot of people that were involved in our visit, and we deeply give our thanks for them. Again, we deeply regret that Chairperson Yvonne Mogoro could not join us during this visit. We wish her a full and speedy recovery. We hope to be able to consult with her in our collaboration with this full report and prepare it in line with the applicable methodology and present it to the Human Rights Council. During the visit, we held a series of meetings in Washington, Atlanta, Los Angeles, Chicago, Minneapolis, and New York City. We met with representatives of civil society and victims, with federal, state, local officials, including from law enforcement, city administrations, judicial actors, police unions, and affinity groups. We also visited 2 correctional facilities in Los Angeles County Jails and the Cook County Jails in Chicago. We wish to thank those who agreed to meet with us and share their testimonies, especially the numerous victims and survivors who shared deeply personal and powerful stories and trauma with us. Today, we'll be presenting some of the preliminary findings, and in the coming weeks, we'll be seeking additional information and processing written submissions from groups and people we were not able to meet with in person or virtually. In the U.S., racial inequity dates back to the very creation of this country, and there'll be no quick fixes to the state of things. It needs a whole government approach. This needs to be more than a slogan and calls for comprehensive reform and strong leadership at all levels. Slavery and legalized discrimination has left deep entrenched legacy that's still experienced in the daily lives of those people of African descent. To this day, racial discrimination permeates through encounters with law enforcement, from first contact, arrest, detention, sentencing, and disenfranchisement. In each of those aspects, available data points to a clear disproportionate of how Black people are affected by law enforcement. Issues of systemic racism in law enforcement in the United States are not new for the United Nations human rights mechanisms. Concerns about the disparate impact of policies and practices of law enforcement of African American and people of African descent have been documented by the human rights mechanisms for many years, and multiple recommendations have already been made. We heard an acknowledgement by all that there are the issues related to racial equity in the U.S., which are deep-rooted and need to be addressed. Yet there is still a lack of awareness and acknowledgement to the extent to which racial inequities impact the daily lives of those affected. For example, given the diverse experience and perspectives, it is evident that there would be a divergent understanding of what safety means and what it needs to be addressed. that merits meaningful reflections and exchanges in those most impacted of respective roles and solutions. So for example, the definition of safety and what it means to be safe is different depending on the community in different cities. But if we're going to also address the definitions of what it means to be safe, we also have to address what it means to be in law enforcement. And we also heard from law enforcement that they have been asked to do too much and that they have become a catch-all for the community's every need. It is known that systemic racism creates harmful association of blackness with criminality and delinquency. This has a direct impact on the interactions of African and people of African descent with law enforcement officials and the criminal justice systems. Authorities at all levels need to speak it loud and stop the denials and act accordingly to address it. Overall, we have heard clear themes throughout the visit. It is time for the United States to address and acknowledge the history of slavery and the impact to this day of race. The overall themes that we've heard from the communities that we met with during our visit is that there is a culminating exhaustion in the Black community, and the exhaustion of being Black and present in the daily lives. I'm going to go over a few themes, and then I'm going to turn it over to Professor Mendez to continue. So when we talk about the themes in relation to law enforcement specifically, one of the things that we did is that we expanded that definition a bit, and we talked about the criminal justice system. Oftentimes when we talk about law enforcement, we stop at talking about law enforcement as if that area is the only area that is in need of reform. But when we listen to community, community talks about a system of criminal justice that is interrelated and interrelated in their lives. And so a few of the themes are as follows. When we talk about societal, community is asking for a robust whole-of-government action that is needed. They need systemic accountability for past and for future violations. This includes mental health services for victims and survivors and for family members. They're asking for allocations of appropriate resources and ensuring robust and holistic reparation support and rehabilitation for victims. And this includes access to justice. And we are echoing existing recommendations of UN human rights mechanisms and other rapporteurs, and we encourage the establishment of a commission to study and develop the reparation proposals for people of African and African descent, whether through a bill or an executive order, in close consultation with those that are most impacted. Mental health. Mental health is a predominant and underlying condition and/or factor of the deadly encounters with police. The interaction of law enforcement in the criminal justice system in regards to people having mental health underlying crisis is very well documented. What we heard from community survivors, victims, and those moving through their everyday lives, that there is predominantly an underlying cause of mental health and that those needs need to be addressed. Not at the end, but the preventative piece in the beginning. And there is a suggestion that the significant number of people of African and African descent that are killed by law enforcement every day have untreated mental health illness needs. And there is an ask that those needs be addressed. Black women, Black trans women, and Black girls. The mechanisms heard testimony on how Black women, Black trans women, Black girls, and femmes are stereotyped as aggressive and angry that increase the likelihood of being used, the likelihood of force being used. They're aged up and oftentimes not afforded the appropriate and often shown the, I would say, deference given young white women or young girls. Again, we heard many stories of the aggressiveness of law enforcement when they are asking questions about why they're being stopped or trying to come to the aid of others who are also younger than they are. Another theme, police culture. When you think about police culture, one of the things in our mechanism and our mandate that we have to think about is the impact of not only police culture on the community, but the diversifying of the police organization when we talk about Black officers. We met with numerous affinity groups through our city visits. Affinity groups originally were created when Black officers were introduced into police organizations, oftentimes discriminated against or segregated in their organizations when brought on. These organizations were created because officers did not have opportunities for promotions or access to things that they need, like equipment, or the opportunities to promote through the ranks. From our meetings with officers through the cities we sat with, those needs are still prevalent today. Many of the Black officers that we spoke to love the job that they do. They love being of service to their community, but they also spoke of the existence of racism, discrimination, white supremacy, and as well as sexism. They also speak of the need to have representation when it comes to access, fairness in promotions, and making sure that there is transparency when it comes to the ability to have access for those special operations or special units. Black officers also spoke in agreement with the community when it comes to overall exhaustion. And this overall exhaustion, as I said earlier, is around negotiating the space in which you have to exist in the United States and the stress of being Black in America. We also met with unions. The police unions spent time with us generously and also spoke of a narrative of being a disruptor to reform. The unions also made it clear that they often are mischaracterized as the groups that are against having conversations or being at the table when it comes to doing different types of initiatives in those communities being served. They agree that the profession needs to change, but they are also very skeptical when they are called to the table because they themselves are not believing they're going to have a fair chance when they do show up. There is also an understanding that the way the unions are set up throughout this country are very different. And oftentimes when unions are spoke of, they are done in a very general way and not understanding that not all unions are collective bargaining and not all unions represent in the same way. And as we have spoken with the community and as we've spoken with law enforcement, policing is very localized, as are unions and affinity groups. White supremacy within law enforcement. Both affinity groups and the unions agree white supremacy is an issue in policing. Where there is disagreement is in the severity and the way in which it should be addressed. There were very candid conversations by both the affinity groups and the unions that what is needed now is police leadership to be brave and bold and to make sure that there are ways in which to identify these officers and make sure that they are not able to continue wearing the badge or to be able to seek employment elsewhere. Officer wellness. The mental health of wellness of officers continues to be a growing concern, especially in many organizations, as they continue to work below authorized staffing. We're aware that untreated mental health issues, sleep deprivation due to shift work, mandatory overtime, impact the ability to make sound decisions. However, with the growing expansion of officer wellness and EAP programs with police departments throughout this country, they continue to be underfunded and they lack the inclusivity to meet the needs of officers, especially those in the intersection, Black officers, trans officers, LGBTQI officers, and the need for the funding of these programs continue to either be absent or to be piecemeal. With these themes, I'd like to turn it over to Professor Mendez to continue.
Thank you very much. We, needless to say, we placed a lot of emphasis on trying to understand the perceived impunity for many of the cases of misconduct of law enforcement that affects persons of African descent, particularly some of those with tragic consequences that are known to the public quite well. Throughout the visit, we heard the harrowing pain of victims and their families, and the resounding calls for accountability and support. We support those calls for accountability unreservedly, and we welcome some measures taken to this effect so far, including the executive orders signed in 2021 and 2022, and in fact also the one announced today that seems to touch on many of the issues that we are going to propose as well. So we're very encouraged by these executive orders that seem to indicate that the federal government takes this matter quite seriously. We also recognize that there have been successful prosecutions like those of the officers indicted in the cases of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. However, many more cases remain unresolved or in impunity, and in this sense, we heard very clearly that when the federal government has sometimes intervened, it has succeeded in breaking what is sometimes called the blue wall of silence. And so the interventions by the Department of Justice have obtained consent decrees that we can tell are a good way of instituting systemic reform in certain agencies throughout the country. We will be calling, therefore, for more assiduous and more proactive use of the intervention of the Justice Department, because it seems like it is a proven method of obtaining accountability for at least the most serious violations. But more robust and whole-of-government action is needed to translate into systemic accountability for past and future violations, and present and current violations as well. This includes boosting oversight mechanisms with power to subpoena documents and compel testimony, and the allocation of appropriate resources to some of these mechanisms. I think it's important to ensure that these mechanisms that show encouraging signs in some of the agencies that we visited are accompanied by robust implementation in specific cases. The practical application of the reasonableness standard and the standard of qualified immunity in matters of civil liability, both are perceived to be applied with a large bent towards impunity. This will merit, of course, on our part, a deeper analysis in our upcoming report, and we will be looking both at the legal standards and understand them correctly, but also at the actual outcomes of how they are applied on the ground. On prevention and guarantees of non-recurrence, the mechanism received numerous allegations of cases of police killings in which police officers involved had prior complaints filed against them for excessive use of force. The mechanism also received allegations of cases where police officers who had previously been found guilty and or disciplined for misconduct were afterwards hired by a different police department. The mechanism is concerned over such lack of accountability, and particularly the lack of a nationwide database or record system to keep track of such cases so as to ensure non-repetition for victims and communities. On racial profiling, in the United States, racial bias, stereotypes, and profiling appear to play a recurrent role in portrayals of or perceptions of what or who is dangerous, quote unquote, and in presumptions of criminality. Racial profiling is used as a basis for discriminatory identity checks, stops and searches, arrests and related abuses, and violence, including serious injury and deaths by law enforcement. Racial profiling should be formally prohibited in legislation. All allegations of racial profiling should be investigated and prosecuted. Disaggregated data for all incidents, complaints, and investigations on racial profiling should be collected, analyzed, and published. On use of force, the mechanism was informed that not all states in the U.S. have regulations in the use of force by law enforcement officials, and that apart from a Supreme Court doctrine, there is no national legislation on the topic. The mechanism further received information indicating that existing local and national standards on the use of force by law enforcement officials do not meet international standards. Laws, policies, procedures, and practices to restrict the use of force by law enforcement officials need to be in compliance with international principles on the use of force and the use of firearms by law enforcement agents, particularly the principles of legality, precaution, necessity, proportionality, accountability, and non-discrimination. These principles should apply in all kinds of operations and all use of force by law enforcement in the United States. On law enforcement in schools, we received troubling reports of a trend towards a growing police presence in schools and accounts of excessive use of force by law enforcement against children in this context, including as a result of nonviolent infringements of school codes of conduct. In this context, we also received evidence of the so-called school-to-prison pipeline, in which education and public safety policies push children, many of them Africans and or of African descent, into the criminal justice system. On anti-racism protests, the mechanism received information on law enforcement responses to anti-racism protests, including human rights violations in this context, such as excessive use of force. Anti-racism protests were followed by widespread legislative measures and initiatives at the state level, which would unduly restrict the right to peaceful assembly. Since several demonstrators currently facing criminal charges for domestic terror are facing criminal charges for domestic terrorism. All legislation regulating the right to peaceful assembly should be in compliance with international human rights standards, including principles on the use of force by law enforcement. In the matter of migration, we are alarmed by examples of overt racism, like an official coin circulated showing a man on horseback, a clear image referring to white supremacy, punishing a person in the border with Mexico. Such expressions of racism call for outright and unequivocal condemnation from officials. Alternatives to detention should also be prioritized, including especially the cases of children and separation from their families. On the matter of corrections, I want to stress that we had excellent access to corrections facilities in Los Angeles County in 2 different locations, and also in the Cook County Jail. We tried in several places to visit corrections facilities, but I want to stress the excellent cooperation we got in those 2 places. However, we did confirm a generalized practice of solitary confinement. The mechanism was alarmed over reports and upon witnessing firsthand the prevalence of solitary confinement. It is estimated that over 80,000 prisoners are held in isolated confinement in the United States at any given day today. The mechanism is especially alarmed as the practice is reported to also apply to juveniles held in super maximum facilities with dramatic effects on their mental health, sometimes leading to suicides. Juveniles in adult facilities are reportedly 36 times more likely to commit suicide. Solitary confinement shall never be imposed upon children or on persons with psychosocial disabilities or on pregnant or breastfeeding women. For adults, legitimate uses of solitary confinement should never exceed the notion of indefinite or prolonged solitary confinement, the latter defined as lasting more than 15 days, as stipulated by the standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners, now called the Nelson Mandela rules. The mechanism encourages the U.S. authorities to privilege alternatives to detention, applying Rule 6.1 of the Tokyo Rules. On mental health in detention, we want to stress that 40% of the detainees in jail are considered seriously mental health population, and the vast majority of them are Afro-Americans. The Los Angeles County jails were described by the correctional authorities themselves as the largest state provider of mental health. The mechanism is of the view that the mental health population, the majority of whom are in prisons, the majority of whom are of African descent, should not be imprisoned to begin with, or should not be treated for their mental illness while incarcerated. And we want to stress that we looked at instances of torture and received some testimony about torture in interrogation or to obtain confessions or to obtain evidence against other persons. Some of the testimonies that we received are from some years ago, but even today, some persons are either have not received certificates of innocence after being convicted on the basis of torture-tainted evidence, or some are even still spending time in prison and having trouble getting those cases reopened. Obviously, the Convention Against Torture establishes a rule called the exclusionary rule, and the United States is a signatory, and so is bound to exclude all evidence obtained under torture or under cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment from any proceedings of any sort, but especially criminal proceedings against a person making the confession. But we want to stress again that the practice of solitary confinement is torture, is psychological torture according to the definition in the Convention. It contributes to the acuity of the mental health crisis in the criminal justice system across the country. Prolonged or indefinite solitary confinement is psychological torture. We heard testimonies indicating use of torture to obtain confessions. And with that, we just want to stress again that we are going to be working on a full report, that these are only preliminary findings, and we're now open to your questions. And
before we do that, though, could we talk just briefly about what is working? There are some things that we should touch on, because I don't want folks to think that this is, all that there is. And as Juan just mentioned, there'll be more in the report. We also received, lots of information around what was showing promise on the ground in regards to programs that were victim survivor centered. And the community itself really had talked about how states and locals could invest in those programs on the ground, and that often doesn't happen. Or if that does happen, they are the first programs to get cut. Secondly, law enforcement also has programs that could be replicated throughout this country that we know show promise. And oftentimes, because the budgets are being cut or there aren't enough staffing to assist with those types of programs, those themselves are being cut. So we have a moment here where we know that we could be rethinking what we mean by safety and what it means to be safe and what it means to have law enforcement in communities in the African descent. So just echoing again what Professor Mendez says, that we will do a fuller report, but there is definitely an opportunity here for the United States to take the lead in a very different way. So I'll end there, Yasmin, and turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much. So now the floor is open for questions from the room. Yes, madam? I don't know if there's a microphone.
Thank you. This is Marta Garde from the Spanish newswire EFE News Services. I would like to know if you have had any surprises in this mission, if you have found anything that you were not expecting to find out, or that you thought that it was already taken care of, being in the US and in 2023.
I would tell you the thing that surprised me the most, I think, was the openness of the unions. That was a surprise to me. I would also say the amount of work that is happening across the unions in regards to trying to participate in what policing looks like in a different context. That was a surprise. I think what also was disheartening was continuing to hear the pain of those survivors, and victims of those who were surviving police encounters, those who had been killed by police, and the fact that services needs are still being unmet as a result of it. And I think for me, I think that was what it is. No, I don't know if you have anything different.
Yeah, I also want to stress that we found, even in the highest authorities of different police departments, a recognition and acknowledgement that this problem exists. Maybe it shouldn't be that shouldn't be surprising, given the public nature of many of the most serious violations. However, we also didn't find a very clear sense of what could be done about it, and that is troubling also because we expect people not only to acknowledge that there is a problem, but also to look at ways at resolving it. I also felt encouraged by some mechanisms at the local and state level to investigate these episodes with guarantees of independence and impartiality, and with what appeared to us to be high level of professionalism. However, these mechanisms are only as good as they can actually succeed on the ground, and it's very important to provide them with more resources and to follow through on what they investigate and find out. And if there is evidence of wrongdoing, that there should be prosecutions following. And that is not left to the mechanisms themselves. It's a prosecutorial decision that is then taken. But the sense of this the twin application of the reasonableness standard and the qualified immunity when it comes to civil liability, give the impression, of course, that there is an obstacle to accountability that is very hard, at this moment at least, very hard to overcome.
Yes, sir. If we can have the microphone.
Thanks. Ed Pilkington from The Guardian. The sort of frame of your mission was George Floyd's murder in 2020. That's been a kind of useful sort of checkpoint for all of us to sort of assess what's happening and how it's going. You've mentioned sort of piecemeal stuff happening, some of it good, some of it not so good, but I'm not hearing a sort of sense of sort of really systemic and determined addressing of the problem. Can you give us a sort of big overview? Has enough been done since George Floyd died in May 2020?
I think that's the challenge, because policing is local. I think, as Professor Mendez pointed out, there is no national standards for data collection, no national standards for use of force, and it's piecemeal because it is locally done. You have states that don't have peace officer standards and training, and when you don't have that kind of unified oversight where you need this is what it looks like. You have some states that are better than others. You have some counties and cities that are better than others. And when you have that, this is what you get. I think that where the communities are asking for help is to do just that. They're asking for a more unified approach that will bring about more accountability. But what makes it difficult is that you have localized law enforcement. And even with localized law enforcement, you are still trying to get people to be accountable to the work and to hold people accountable. And if it's still this hard, the question is, what happens on a federal level when you try to do this? And I think, to your point, we're coming up on the anniversary of Mr. Floyd's homicide. when we do this retrospective here in a couple of weeks, there will be some gains made, but this is the exhaustion of the community. The gains always seem to be incremental. But the question then and the concern is not to slip back, but to continue to move forward. And I think that is the hope of the community. But that's the difficultiness of all of this. It is local. Policing is local. And the localness of it gives you the patchwork.
I think it's important to point out to national and nationwide initiatives, and I think the executive orders, especially the one announced today, is very welcome. But it's important for Congress to negotiate and pass the George Floyd Act that has been stalled in Congress, because I think the national legislation will also help a lot in aligning the states and the localities with the national purpose of eliminating racism in law enforcement. Without congressional action, we'll still have some progress, but there would be a roadblock there to more improvement.
Is there any other question from the room? I think this.
Slightly different to my colleague's question about what surprised you. I mean, you must have heard a lot of searing stories on your travels from people who have been at the sharp end of brutal law enforcement techniques or terrible solitary confinement, or you've heard a lot of appalling stories, I imagine. And I just wondered if any particular individual stories will stay with you after this visit in terms of harrowing details of what people have been through.
They'll all stay with me. There isn't one that is more important than the other. They're all, and then they're the ones that weren't in the room. So there were many more, and there were more that were before that. So historically, there wasn't one that was more important than the other.
Yeah, the same with me, but I would like to say that in coordination with civil society, we really heard a lot of stories. In some cases, I don't know, 15 or 20 testimonies in less than a day, and obviously we got the sense that we were only listening to the tip of the iceberg because the stories were so consistent with each other. So it's difficult to single out one or over others. But we also want to say that especially when it came to the victims themselves or the parents of victims of killings, the stories were very persuasive, very convincing.
And I would also add, too, that, for our work, not just in the United States, the fact that the stories were similar to those in Sweden. So, we are having this conversation with those of African descent, not just in the United States. The stories around the world, if you're of African descent, are the same. And so I think that a loss is a loss, even more compelling so when it's your child. But I'm with Juan on this as well, the coordinating impact of civil society, but no matter, it's a difference. You were coming out of COVID, but it's a different if this was Zoom. But when you're in the room, and it's palatable, and that I think that makes it even more powerful when you are sitting next to someone who, as they will tell you, it's every day for them. It never goes away, and it's a pain you can't dismiss or find something to make it dissipate.
So we will now turn to the journalists that are connected remotely, and I recognize Mrs. Bianca Hillier. So I don't know how to connect, if she will have the floor.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, my name is Bianca Hillier. I'm with the World Radio Program. You mentioned that the United States invited you here. I'm wondering which came first. Was it the invite or your desire to come and hear stories from the U.S.? And secondly, what does your trip say about the state of racial justice and police violence in the U.S.? I mean, why was it country on your list important to visit?
You want to answer the first part?
Well, like all other special procedures, working groups and special rapporteurs, we are invited because we asked to be invited, obviously. But I have to say that the fact that we are invited by the United States is itself a recognition that there is a problem and a recognition that there is something that needs to be done. And hopefully we can help find the appropriate solutions. But of course, it'll be up to governmental authorities, but also in good coordination with civil society, that will ultimately, make progress on eliminating racism in law enforcement. We have, as Tracy said, been before to Sweden. We have invitations to several other countries, and we are going to Brazil at the end of this year. After that, we will see which other invitations we accept. But in the meantime, we have also been doing consultations with many governments and with civil society in different regions of the world. And so we are getting a picture about the impact of racism in law enforcement and especially the impact on people of African descent. And hopefully that will give us some ways of suggesting and recommending measures that need to be taken.
We now have Callan Gray. You have the floor.
Good afternoon. I'm Callan Gray. I'm a reporter at KSTP TV station in Minneapolis, St. Paul. I wanted to ask, I know you were here in the Twin Cities just a couple of days ago on Tuesday, and I wanted to find out specifically if you have feedback from your visit here in Minneapolis, what your major takeaways were here, and if you feel specifically in the Twin Cities if there has been any progress.
It's too soon for us to have that particular conversation and recommendation. I can tell you that, again, like the other cities, we were hosted by civil society, again, meeting with survivors and victims there in Minneapolis. We were, meeting again with city officials. We still are going to be receiving written inputs. We know there's been a lot of work that's happened in Minneapolis, so we're still going to be doing a lot of reading and conversation yet to be had. To begin to make any kind of determination and recommendations around Minneapolis specifically, but as a whole.
Yeah, I want to say that in addition to civil society testimony that we got, we did have good access to authorities, and they discussed with us some initiatives that sound promising, although of course we need to learn more about them. We need to process information that we got in as documentation, and it's a little early for us to pass final judgment on any of this. That's why we're stressing that these are preliminary findings. But what I can say is that there was a spirit of collaboration with us in the whole of Minneapolis, both in civil society and in the authorities.
We have a question in the chat from Farah Mina, a Minnesota-based reporter with the Imprint. And the question is, what did you find when it comes to the child welfare and juvenile justice systems? What needs to be done on that front to prevent harms to Black children and youth?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. We did hear testimony in regards to the operation of the separation of Black children from parents. We did hear testimony in regards to how that happens, why it happens, and the disproportionality in the way in which that happens. we still have additional information that's coming in. And like we do with all our visits in the cities, we still need to do follow-up and to have conversations, but still too soon for us to make any other recommendations around it. But we heard a lot of testimony around children's services and this pervasiveness of specifically separating Black children, children of African descent, away from families, and the process and the way in which that is used.
Yes, and of course, when it is this separation is enforced by law enforcement, it falls directly under our mandate, even if it's ordered by a different agency. But what I would also say is that in juvenile detention, the practice of solitary confinement has to end. It has to end completely and fully for any child, anybody under 18. Because that is the prohibition in the Convention on the Rights of the Child and on the Mandela rules, and we hope that ending solitary confinement, at least of children, is not that difficult a goal to be achieved relatively soon.
I see no more questions from the room, the remote chat. I don't know, there's time for one more question, possibly, if any of the two journalists in the room have one. Otherwise, we will close the press conference.
Thank you.
I see
Thank you.
none, so
Thank you all for being here.
Thank you for being here.
And for the questions filed remotely as well.
Yeah. Thank you all for those of you joining us on Zoom as well. Thank you.